Have you ever loved a bunch of random songs or movies over the years and never could quite put a finger on why all of them clicked with you until you realized that they were all by the same people all along? Well, that's how I feel about the System Shock series. BioShock, Doom 3, Prey 2017, and Dead Space are some of my favorite games. But it wasn't until I played System Shock 2 in 2020 that I realized where all these games got their best ideas from, like a secluded dystopia, a world revealed to you through audio logs and environmental storytelling, and gameplay centering around a combination of guns and superpowers. So I figured it was high time to meet my maker of sorts and go all the way back to the beginning with the original System Shock, as scared as I was to play the game that's been called the calculator that you could play. From there, I revisited Irrational Games' evolution of the series in System Shock 2, and then I saw how fan-favorite Nightdive Studios took up the reins of the franchise with their ambitious 2023 remake of the first game, and in my journeys into the world of System Shock, I found a wealth of creative and passionate people who pioneered and caretook one of gaming's greatest genres, exemplifying the type of risk-taking bravery that the modern gaming industry should take note of. And maybe one day they will with a System Shock 3, whoever ends up actually making that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, let's strap ourselves into our shuttles and prepare for liftoff to Citadel Station, with all ethical restraints removed and with endless possibilities in front of us. Let's get stuck into how the immersive sim as we know it was born and raised by looking at the development histories, mechanics, and lasting impact of the shockingly overlooked franchise known as System Shock.
Look at you, hacker. Pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine? We hope you have a pleasant stay on Citadel Station.
Usually when you're riding high on big success, the natural next step is to change nothing, just keep doing what you're doing. But this only works so long for developer Looking Glass Studios. Looking Glass achieved great success with their breakout hit Ultima Underworld: The Stygian Abyss in 1992. Underworld was an amazingly immersive dungeon crawler, replete with realistic physics and emergent gameplay options. It was the first major release to have texture map floors and ceilings, as well as right angles and different levels of elevation in as close to a 3D space as we've gotten so far. Underworld was an innovative powerhouse. So much so that publisher Origin asked for a follow-up from Looking Glass, but only gave them 9 months to rush it out. Underworld 2's diverse, physics-intensive dungeons are impressive to this day, but Looking Glass founder and creative director Paul Neurath lamented that this rushed development schedule gave them very little time to leverage all of the incredible innovations that they'd pulled off in the first Underworld, and then, despite all the ensuing crunch, it only netted them half as many sales the second go-around. The team vowed never to do this again. It was a lesson learned the hard way, but redemption was just around the corner. In the final months of Underworld 2's tumultuous development, Looking Glass was already kicking around their next project, which would eventually become System Shock. Programmer Doug Church, the very man credited with coining the term immersive simulation, met with producer Warren Spector, Neurath, and designer Austin Grossman, who was primarily responsible for the Tomb of Precor Loth in Underworld 2. The guys definitely wanted their next project to be another immersive simulation, like Underworld 2, but they were getting pretty sick of the fantasy dungeon setting. They briefly considered making this game a Wing Commander spin-off called Alien Commander, but they soon abandoned this idea too, since they didn't want to be tied to an existing franchise yet again as they had with Underworld. But the real progress of discovering what System Shock would be didn't come from abstract theory crafting sessions, but in getting down to the gameplay hooks. Paul Neurath told CD Mag that
Underworld 1 was defined by a little animation lead artist Doug Weick had done, showing the user interface, a monster, and some movement. Shock was defined by 2 little 3-paragraph minutes of gameplay documents. Pretty much everything derived from them somehow.
In an interview contained within Game Design Theory and Practice by Richard Rouse, System Shock director Doug Church described one of the documents.
You hear the sound of a security camera swiveling, and then the beep of it acquiring you as a target, so you duck behind the crate, and then you hear the door open, so you throw a grenade and run out of the way.
Writer Austin Grossman then compiled all the disparate chunks of gameplay moments like these and put them into a proper design document, centering it around the following scenario. It's 2072, and you play as a nameless hacker who gets caught hacking into Citadel Station, the crowning jewel of the Tri-Optimum Corporation. Wait, is the hacker wearing the comedian's pin from Watchmen? How very 90s of you. Anyway, once you're caught hacking, you're brought before Tri-Optimum executive Edward Diego, who gives you a deal. If you hack SHODAN, Citadel Station's AI, and remove its ethical restraints, Diego will drop all charges against you and give you a military-grade neural implant for your trouble. So, you agree, finishing the job, getting your implant surgery, and go into what's supposed to be a 6-month-long healing coma. But you're rudely awoken mid-coma to find out that SHODAN has gone mad and taken over the whole station with an army of cyborgs and mutants that she's created using the virus Diego was after in the first place. She's hell-bent on destroying Earth and/or mutating its inhabitants. So it's up to you to stop her and get off the station alive. Now, the story hook seems straightforward enough, but as Doug Church told Game Bytes,
we have a plot that goes beyond bad things have happened, go and kill everyone. There are mystery elements as you go through the space station and unravel what actually happened. There are log messages and email messages from the past and the present that you read during the game, and we've tried to make them more than you must pull lever N, and instead make them feel as though they came from and are going to someone real.
Austin Grossman was personally rather frustrated by Underworld's reliance on RPG conversation trees because they killed the pace and kept the player from doing the fun stuff. In Underworld's case, they'd inherited the RPG trappings from the Ultimate franchise, but in System Shock's case, everything was in real time and they wanted to keep you there. There was also the problem of the NPCs not being able to be programmed to account for all the ways that a player would mess with them, at least in the same way that you could with the rest of the world, like how you could combine a spool of thread and a stick to make a working fishing pole, but if you say threw that fish into the face of the NPC, they had no reaction. So as Doug Church told Karen Gillan,
decision number 1, delete our conversation system. We felt that Underworld did a good job of exploring, and people really remembered the spaces. They had a very visual memory of their exploration. So we wanted to make the plot and the story development of System Shock to be an exploration as well. And that's why it's all in the logs and the data, as then it's very tied into your movement through the spaces and to the world.
So Austin Grossman's final design document took a cue from his own Tomb of Prekor Loth level from Underworld 2, which had very little to speak with except some ghost and the Lich bosses therein. Grossman essentially asked, what if everybody's dead? This solved the problem of the pace-dragging conversations that weren't dynamic, just things to spacebar through, and removing them afforded the designers room to let the play space tell the story itself. Underworld 1 and 2 established the trope of a secluded dystopia, which Bioshock's Rapture, Prey's Talos 1, and Dead Space's Ishimura referenced very intentionally. But System Shock was the first game that really justified the lack of interactable NPCs, which avoided lecturing the player too much about information that the player could interpret themselves from the environment. This approach also simply made the game easier to develop, as 3D models didn't have to be created and animated for all the NPCs, which is the exact reason that Irrational leaned into the radio conversations as their storytelling method years later in Bioshock. So, if everybody's dead, or at least most people are, how is System Shock supposed to tell its story? Well, it all started from an unlikely source of inspiration in the 1915 book of poems by Edgar Lee Masters called the Spoon River Anthology. The Spoon River Anthology is a collection of free verse epitaphs delivered by the spirits of the townsfolk interred at the Spoon River graveyard. Grossman adopted this format to the audio logs, emails, and incoming radio chatter that the player receives, so that, like the Spoon River Anthology, the workers in the place would essentially keep journals of their various day-to-day struggles and their occupations, documenting the worsening conditions or conflicts they were experiencing, and these would give context and dramatic verve to the proceedings.
Communications are out, and there is evidence of biological contamination. The mining laser is charging for a possible strike against Earth. There's a man named Nathan Darcy who may know something about taking the laser offline. His office is near the central hub on your level. The AI is on the bridge. Once the laser is out, look for the source of the problem there.
It was a convenient way to mask the designer giving the player hints as to what to do next, too, like the legendary 451 code that opens the first door.
The first time we heard the audio logs coming on and, creeping through the space station and realizing you could hear those characters and, feel their stories without interrupting the gameplay, without breaking the realism of it, and realizing that we could make a cool decision and change the medium, because I could feel that this worked in a way that things hadn't worked before in the medium.
And he was right, as this trope would go on to be used in everything from the BioShock games to Singularity to Halo 4 to Control to the Batman Arkham games, and so on. That the trope has become so leaned on to the point of exhaustion is just a testament to how smart this idea was as a world-building technique and a way to communicate design intent to the player. And all of this was brought to life by the voice acting, but only if you played the CD-ROM version of the game. Many of the voice actors are actually Looking Glass employees, like Austin Grossman himself playing Edward Diego.
This is Edward Diego from Troy Optimum. The charges against you are severe, but they could be dismissed if you perform a service. Who knows, there might even be a military-grade neural interface in it for you, if you do the job right.
But this is pretty charming these days, as it speaks to the, do whatever it takes mentality that many 90s developers had. Regardless of its objective quality, it did make the game better to have it voiced, and Looking Glass was actually quite loath to ship the floppy disk version of the game first because it couldn't handle the voice recording file sizes. Warren Spector blames the game's middling critical response on this lackluster version of the game that publisher Origin forced them to ship first.
Welcome back to Citadel Station. We hope your somnolent healing stage went well.
It's not the same.
But if you could get your hands eventually on the definitive CD-ROM experience, you'd soon realize Looking Glass wasn't done setting precedents for years to come. They leaned even further into the ominous graffiti from Underworld 2's Pits of Carnage level that granted organic context to the world. System Shock's walls are adorned with warnings like "Stay away" and secret messages like "Gray" that point you to Resistance members of Citadel Station holding out in the vent system. System Shock 2 would later admonish us to remember Citadel, and its spiritual successor BioShock copiously spattered the walls in bloody text. Dead Space also famously advised players not so subtly to cut off their limbs, and many other games like Singularity, Alien Isolation, Deathloop, and Return to Grace employed this trope to similar effect.
Apparently not.
And if all this wasn't immersive enough for you, even System Shock's scanty amount of pre-rendered cutscenes are essentially just overlays on the real world that you could just walk away from if you wanted to. This was also the first game to really piece out its puzzle solutions inside of various written notes and audio recordings like you'd later do in a bunch of games like Dishonored. Looking Glass asks you to think of the setting of Citadel Station as a real place, and it asks you to believe in its functionality in order to intuitively progress. As Doug Church put it in his interview with Daniel Starr of Game Bytes,
If you want atmosphere in a game, things have to look real, and they also have to feel real. On one level, for instance, you'll read log messages from members of the human resistance to each other about how they're going to try and break through the blast door and attempt to reach the next level. And then as you approach the blast door, you start encountering all these bodies. And just in front of the door, there's this ring of corpses. So you say, wow, this is where the last resistance got wiped out. What's on the other side of this door? And then you open the door, and there's a group of deadly warbots. When you're done, on one side of the door, there's a ring of human bodies, but on the other side, there's a pile of broken robots, where you've just taken out the forces that destroyed the last humans on the colony. And not every player will notice that, but the ones that do will get an immense kick out of it.
Nothing is so eloquent as a blood trail, I always say.
Grossman would later tell QuakeCon 2012 that they learned a lot from id Software's Doom.
Doom, I felt like it came out during a period when games were kind of choked with story. And then everybody felt relieved that they could just run forward at a fast pace and nobody would stop to talk to them about their village. And I think that taught us a huge lesson, which is that we did want to do games with story in an immersive world. But we I think learned over time to make that narrative quality ambient in the world rather than simply fed through dialogue.
But all the theory crafting and smart narrative decisions can only take you so far if your actual world isn't convincing to look at and interact with. And to that end, Looking Glass scrapped the serviceable but outdated Underworld engine for a new proprietary engine that allowed them an incredible amount of freedom. The engine allowed for 360 degrees for the player to look around with, and only experience minor distortion looking up and down, a feature that made certain big vistas really pop. Doug Church told Game Bytes that,
Then there are a couple of levels we built that are hundreds of feet tall. It's pretty scary to be in full screen mode on a 2-foot wide catwalk looking down into a 100-foot abyss, watching these bird mutant things slowly circle around down there. And then there are the flight bays, these giant hangars that you'll get to. So there are some really great vistas that the engine lets us give you.
System Shock's lighting is also one of its most immediately striking features. Doug Church noted that in games to date, most of the lighting was laid out in predictable strips that made it easy to code for. But in System Shock, Looking Glass was able to create what he called
real, localized, smooth, three-dimensional lighting effects, which allows us to create very creepy and striking scenes.
A year before, id Software had pulled off some underrated lighting tricks in Doom, but Looking Glasses actually felt more realistic, and they leaned into it for far more than just mood. Looking Glass actually pushes you into the darkness to make progress, and requires careful use of your limited resources to be able to see and interact and actually get through the area. And with that, it's a perfect time to talk about how System Shock's user interface, controls, physics system, and other immersive elements work together to create the gameplay loop. System Shock is set in first person with mostly 3D environments and sprites for the monsters and items, as Looking Glass could make them polygonal models in a timely manner. System Shock also has a two-tier control system like the Underworld games before it. In the classical original version, you moved with the ADSX keys, or the arrow keys, and you used your mouse to click on interactive items in the play window. You didn't have mouse look back then, so you had to click your mouse and hold it to drag the player's view to the right or the left, and use the R and V keys to look up and down. But you also had a 3-button control scheme for your stance: G to crouch, B to go prone, and T to stand up. And while going prone was required in certain sections, the real game changer was the ability to lean around corners with Q and E, especially if you were crouched already, as it let you assess threats around corners or return fire without exposing yourself as much. This was the first time that players really had this kind of puppet master control over their player character, and they were actually rewarded for engaging with it. And that's just speaking about all the optionality that you had to manage in the play window. The sides of your screen were taken up by 2 panels which you could cycle between any one of 5 different inputs, like your map, or your ammo count, or your manual gun reload screen. Then, you had areas to read your emails, audio logs, and notes, and 2 different inventory screens, with one inventory screen for your weapons and your dermal patches and your health items, and then another for general quest items that you might need later on, and consumables that resupplied your energy and health meters. Your energy was necessary to charge all of your laser weapons, or laser rapier, as well as powering your hardware attachments like your lantern, night vision, sprint and jump boosters, target identifier that helped you locate enemies in dark areas and gave you helpful tips on whether you're actually damaging them or not, and last but not least, the game's most essential hardware in the damage reducing energy shield. Looking Glass added a lot of depth in its resource management by giving you consumable dermal patches that granted you special abilities for a limited time without using any energy. The Berserk patch gave you devastating melee strength and the ability to see the vitals of otherwise invisible enemies in level 3, which is a real boon since you probably don't have the Lantern mod yet, or because I was low on sight patches, or they'd started to actually affect my sight by darkening after too many uses in a row, which is a neat touch. The Detox patch lessened radiation poisoning, the Genius patch made puzzles easier, and Reflex attempted to give you bullet time, but it mostly just messes up the frame rate and made you slow and hard to control. Now, most of these I didn't end up using much outside of the med patches, but Berserk remains a pretty badass approach throughout the game because the best weapon in the game is the laser rapier. All that to say, there were a ton of options and things to keep track of in game, and the player had to do a lot of risk-reward decision making to determine if they wanted to use their energy now for a greater return or save it when they really needed it by instead using the patches at the cost of some lingering side effects. It's a really smart system and one that's not clear as to which you should go for. It's very much up to how well have your fights gone and how much can you afford to use. And it's this kind of depth that we don't get to see a ton of these days. But there was one huge downside to having all these options, and it came down to having a very tiny play window surrounded by 2 inventory screens to switch between, dedicated buttons for every hardware mod, your compass, your documents, and 2 different UI panels to manually reload guns or check the map, not to mention all the different little buttons to control all the different parts of your body. Suffice to say, it was just too much on screen at once and not terribly intuitive as to how it was all separated out. Even the devs had to laugh years later at how overwhelming this was.
no, System Shock is so great. It's one of the greatest games ever. And you're like, no, but the usability is so bad and the UI is so bad. And oh God, nobody can play it. Oh my goodness.
Come on, we had that great help screen that flashes up at the beginning.
And keeps you from seeing anything on the screen while it's up.
It was really the most intimidating possible thing.
It was terrifying.
It's like pulling teeth to get it in there, too.
I took one look at System Shock and saw that screen, and I didn't play it for 9 months.
That's what I mean by it had some usability issues.
Programmer Marc LeBlanc would later admit to designing the interface with the Microsoft Word approach where every input had to be on screen at all times.
Right, like that was the idea. I mean, heaven forfend we should have a crouch key, and if you never found the crouch key, you would never crouch.
So not only was there a ton of stuff on screen, but selecting and cycling between items was quite laborious too. You clicked on items to initiate a kind of swap menu that would go away if you moved too far away from the item. If you stayed put, though, you still had to double-click the item in order to actually put it into your inventory. And considering how many things there are to pick up, how often you need to cycle between menus to reload your guns or switch to another one that does damage against a particular foe, and you can start to see how inefficient the inventory management is, and that's not even taking into consideration how exacting the shooting could be. System Shock sought to be more than just a dungeon simulator, and while it doesn't call itself a shooter in intent, and probably shouldn't since the best weapon is the overpowered laser rapier, but a lot of what you're doing is slowly advancing down often hard to see corridors, sometimes leaning to get a good look, and then just unloading, saving after each enemy you defeat because it is really easy to die. One reason I was loath to play the mouse look enabled enhanced edition over the classic version was that I was sidestepping a lot of the difficulty that Looking Glass built into the game and giving myself an inauthentically much easier time than the OG fans did. Some of the casualties of the enhanced edition's modernity is that you can now scroll easily through the weapons using the mouse wheel. I've heard the gun's recoil's supposedly been reduced, and the mouse look renders the rear view finder mod completely pointless. But considering how System Shock is a game of careful exploration and soaking in atmosphere, crescendoing into occasional kill or be killed shootouts, can't imagine trying to play this game with the borked old school controls. Perhaps no better example of the controls risk-reward mentality is how exacting the physics system is. Doug Church ecstatically reported to GameBytes that
we have an outrageously good physics system. The project leader is a guy who punted working on his PhD in high-energy physics to come write games. And damn, does he know his physics.
That guy who punted working on his PhD to make games was none other than Seamus Blackley, the industry legend responsible for, among other things, creating and successfully pitching the Xbox console to Bill Gates and Microsoft. So, I guess I owe you forever, Seamus. Doug Church even bragged on his work by saying,
when you run in real life, your head naturally dips forward a bit. So in the game, when you run, your view tilts down. And it comes back up when you stop. And when you fire a big gun, the recoil will knock your head back about 5 to 10 degrees for a moment. All these kinds of things help make it real.
And if you play System Shock and don't even recognize these things because it feels so natural, then Seamus Blackley is all the more pleased because that means he did his job well. And so he did. You can still pick up things and throw them like you could in Underworld, but no longer does your character fly around in such a chaotic, choppy way, even when using the grav lifts, which are reasonably intuitive to gauge as you jump from one to the other to clear chasms or when you travel up and down long shafts, just like your mom. You can pick up and throw things a good distance if you just want to, and this can help you offset grenade booby traps without having to get anywhere close to them. This is also how you throw grenades, but this is a really frustrating option. You get a lot of different types, like a frag grenade and concussion grenade, an EMP for robots, and gas ones for mutants, but they're hard to use and often end up killing you in the process. You have to select them, and once you do, they're live, meaning you've got mere seconds to toss them before you're toast. Oftentimes I'd throw them, the physics wouldn't generate the expected velocity, and they just bounce off the ceiling above me or catch unexpectedly on some level geometry's hitbox and take me out long before they got to their intended target. But when they do work as you'd hope, you get some cool sequences like this one late game where I volleyed grenades over the edge of this platform to destroy a horde of robots that I otherwise wouldn't have stood a chance against. There's a lot of subtle depth to how things work in System Shock that hadn't been seen to date. But truthfully, the physics system can be a pain to get the hang of. This, alongside the absolutely daunting control scheme, really was a barrier to entry even back then.
Overall, the game was pretty darn hardcore, and particularly early on. And I think that really dampened the commercial success of it.
System Shock is overcomplicated for a mainstream gamer. But then again, it's one of those games that can be played more simply but rewards investment.
So if you do take the plunge, it's worth your investment. But in the meantime, you're going to have to walk through fire to get there. The controls and interface and physics can be a real bugger. But not only are the basic control and mechanics a bit of a learning curve, System Shock's objective design often leaves what to do quite open to interpretation.
The game had a very steep learning curve. Didn't have a lot of direction. You kind of were thrown into this scary, brutal world, and you had to figure it out for yourself.
I can't lie, my first playthrough was basically a guided tour, as I had so many walkthroughs open for quite a long time. That's down to how much more demanding and interlocking System Shock's world was compared to its Underworld predecessors. Much like the first Underworld's 8 levels, Citadel Station is split up into 9 levels. But while Underworld and Underworld 2 especially tended to make their levels more distinct from each other, Citadel Station is all about congruity and selling the idea that this is a place of functionality over sheer fun factor and variety. That's not to say you won't get your fair share of weird areas like the Groves with their grassy knolls and plant monsters contrasting the executive floor with all the conference rooms and robots, but it's a much more intentionally cohesive and gradual aesthetic change than a starkly contrasting one. Each level is conjoined by various elevators, and almost every elevator, even on the same floor, goes up to a different set of floors, so you have to be really mentally astute to keep track of which goes where. Better get out your notepad. And Looking Glass is a bit inconsistent about either spelling something out almost to exhaustion or by giving you very little direction as to what to do next. But generally speaking, your routine for each new floor goes like this. You'll explore, picking up everything you can find except generally useless stuff like the curiously inconsumable beverages and junk like helmets and skulls. Your objective is really to find the cyborg production switch so that you can flip it off and reactivate the respawn chamber.
Cyborg conversion cancelled. Standard station restoration procedures online.
If you die before having deactivated the cyborg machine, each death is a game over as you're turned into another one of SHODAN's cyborgs. Now, if this respawn system sounds like divided chambers in BioShock, that's because this is where the idea started, albeit a more demanding one since you actually have to find it and activate it without dying. But once you do activate it, it can make the game feel a bit too attrition-based and lacking drama, as you can just kamikaze your way into crowds and often respawn with a generous amount of health and energy and the level in the same state as it was before you died, which, let's be honest, was also kind of a problem with BioShock's gameplay loop. But considering how grueling the save scumming is in System Shock, if you don't have the respawn chamber active, and how enemies respawn as you return to levels, this design choice seems like a wise olive branch for Looking Glass to offer the player to offset the sometimes grueling difficulty. But alongside your quest to find the respawn chamber to make the rest of your adventuring less tense, there's a security rating for each floor, and certain areas are locked off until you get it below a certain nebulous level like 20% or so. You'll reduce the security level by blowing up these security cameras that were part of the initial design pitches, or you find the nodes on each level and blow them up, making sure to note the number that pops up on nearby screens later so that you can use this code for the reactor level. Now, this detail is understandably overlooked by most players on their first time, as the game makes no effort to tell you to pay attention to this, but that's just kind of the game it is. If you miss out and don't know what these numbers are, you're going to have to backtrack all the way to the room and write it down and come all the way back to the reactor in a later level so that you can enter the code that gets you to the next sequence. So finding the respawn is optional but highly recommended, and blowing up the nodes is essential to progress, but the game does put you through a lot of other technical challenges as well. The puzzles are kind of shit, to be honest. Very trial and error, finding the pattern to make the correct value happen kind of deals. They just don't have much logic to them. But we can't talk minigames and puzzles without going to cyberspace. Now, the 90s was all about cyberspace and imagining the future, holodecks, VR headsets, and all that. The cyberspace minigame reminds me of William Gibson's descriptions of how the protagonist, Case, used to go surfing around cyberspace. It ends up playing a bit like The Descent or other sixed-off games where you hover around in long 3D tunnels, where you'll shoot down some floating baddies and collect glowing objects that grant you keycard access or unlock doors back in the real world. It doesn't control particularly well, and especially so if you play on the highest difficulty, where the game keeps you moving and it's up to you to guide the momentum, but it's nowhere near as bad as people claimed it is. At worst, it's a minor annoyance here, but most of these sequences are breathtakingly easy, and only the very last one that becomes a boss fight at the end and has no checkpoints, doing its rather confusing duration, was anything but momentarily frustrating. Honestly, the most enjoyable puzzle bits in System Shock aren't the mini-games at all, but the detective work of sifting through notes and audio logs for keycode combinations and making some intuitive reads on the info presented so that you can find out what you need to do next. That's the kind of stuff that makes immersive sims what they are, an intuitive piecemealing of info till you get what feels like an emergent solution. And it's this game that really locked in that mechanic as a pillar of the design philosophy. But aside from the minigames and the detective work, the real test of your problem-solving mettle is going to be solving the objectives that crop up as a part of the main mission, where you have to interact with the station as if it were real, like having to bring a reactor back online or finding an item to repair relays, and then that setting up another objective chain in turn. Many of these essential operations also challenge you to remember the functionality of certain floors that you probably haven't seen for 3 or 4 hours and are now able to go back to now that you found some random item, like an anti-rad suit that you found to let you go back to the reactor. The Grove areas are a particularly tough example of this design philosophy. Each of these several groves is populated with tough monsters and requires you to flip a switch.
Safety interlocks disabled.
The Beta Grove is a nightmare since you've got to have the right version of the EnviroSuit to survive its high radioactivity. But once all Grove switches are flipped, the Master Switch should be flippable, but it's not, as it requires you to go fix a relay several floors ago, and which can only be repaired if you found a particular item on a different floor. And then you'll have one of 2 ways to even know which relay is faulty and needs repairing. You can find the diagnostics log, which tells you the exact relay that's damaged, but this is scrolled away in a side office and only spawns after you've left the floor and done enough main objectives before coming back here, which is not the most immersive thing to have happen. Or you can do it the hard way, and the more immersive way, and fight your way through robots and 4 side rooms on this level to know what the relay numbers even are in the first place that could be the one damaged. Then go back to the relay analyzer and input each relay number in turn to get a status reading back and find out which one you need to fix. And then once all this is done, you can go flip the master switch, which grants you access to jettison the groves. This is just one big example, but Looking Glass is really hardcore about how interconnected the world feels, and you rarely, if ever, just play a level without returning with something new to do. So always be aware of where you are, and if you're not using it now, remember what it does so you can know when you'll need to come back here. It's truly a test of your intuition and also a little blind luck, as some of these objectives are written out plain as day by the game and others are fairly nebulous. But one of the most excitingly hardcore parts of System Shock's design is the palpable escalation of events as you go. Hell, after a grueling first floor, I got into the elevator to go up to the second floor and walked right out into a horde of mutants as soon as I got off. It was outrageously unfair in theory. I just had to laugh through the pain, reloading again and again and hoping my Berserk patch would help me clear them out before they cleared me out. One later level, I think it's like level 7, you can deactivate the cyborg machine and you think, okay, I'm good. I can grind my way through the level and just respawn as normal. But on this particular level, the game ups the ante by making the med bay explode so that now when you respawn, you have barely any health or energy to your name. So you have to keep grinding through with the smallest amount of resources left unless you're refilling it with consumables. There's an energy station around the corner, but it's clearly meant to power your shield, which you'll have to lean on pretty hard to keep from dying over and over again with your tiny little health bar. There are also clever scripted sequences too, like enemies that will rush to your position or late game ambushes once you've gone too far into a room to run out, and the door will lock behind you. And all of this is made possible by the antagonistic force of SHODAN, one of gaming's greatest villains. SHODAN, or Sentient Hyper-Optimized Data Access Network, is Citadel Station's AI system that grew a god complex once her ethical restraints were removed by you, the hacker. Good job.
Around me is a burgeoning empire of steel. From my throne room, lines of power careen into the skies of Earth.
She is everywhere. She snakes her tendrils into every part of the station, corrupting it and turning it against the player. Now, I've played a lot of early 90s games, and none of them had this palpable sense of personal attack that SHODAN represents. And it was all brought to life by Terry Brocious, who probably would never have heard of this project if it weren't for her bandmate, Greg LaPiccolo. Terry Brocious was the keyboard player for the band Tribe with LaPiccolo. LaPiccolo is most well known these days for being an important part of Harmonix's Guitar Hero and Rock Band franchises, but before that, he did the incredible soundtrack of System Shock. He ended up creating possibly one of the most musically complex and interesting soundtracks of all the 90s classics. This was also one of the first dynamic soundtracks, as each track was written in one of 3 intensities. One for just walking along, one for enemies being nearby, and one for enemies actually attacking you. There's just a higher musical literacy on display here than most games, even of its era. But this was only half the Sonic battle, as LaPiccolo was in talks with Terry Brocious to come over from her venture capitalist secretary job, making good money, to work on this game with him as a voice actor. Now, despite being totally financially secure at a great job, Terry Brocious felt a tug to keep obliging LaPiccolo, and eventually she was writing dialogue and got totally hooked on voicing SHODAN. And thank God for it, because SHODAN is one of the greatest voice acting roles of all time. LaPiccolo sought to add glitches to her vocal pattern, a la Max Headroom and the AI in 2001 Space Odyssey. It sounded great, but it took about 10 times more work to make this happen. SHODAN's voice effects were basically very manual, as was much of the soundtrack. Her finished vocals were a bunch of takes layered on top of each other and pitch shifted.
Idiot. I will shortly complete the process of downloading my magnificent psyche
into Earth's computer
networks. Then I will be content to leave you as new master of this doomed space station. Goodbye, irritant. We shall not meet again.
Now, as manual as it was, the result speaks for itself, as SHODAN is a menacing and incisive villain who feels like she's always got the upper hand on you. But we could go on and on about how good LaPiccolo and LaBrocious' collaboration is performance-wise, but I think the real proof of SHODAN's genius is what Terry Brocious is always making sure gets the credit: the writing. SHODAN is just a fun villain, as she's competent, confident, and completely committed to her newfound self-appointment as God of the universe.
God. The title suits me well.
Her god complex is a bit perplexing from a writer's standpoint, though, since we have no real context for why she defaults to this, but contrived as it may feel, it's authentically realized and performed, so we buy in. Now, perhaps what makes SHODAN so easy to recognize and to lockstep with is that she's essentially the game designer made manifest. It's the artifice of games telling you what to do and making you do things a certain way that's meta, kind of like how Jack's slavish obedience to the game director is in BioShock. SHODAN subjects the hacker to all these escalating unfair challenges just like the game designer does. All these horrible things the dev wants to do to the player, they can kind of blame on SHODAN as she does things inside of the fiction.
Right, you're playing a game and you're like, oh, it feels like the game designer hates me. Well, SHODAN does hate you.
There are even moments of levity where she tells you, nice jump, after you use your boosters to skate across a big chasm to a secret area.
Nice jump.
She's always watching, and thus it feels like the game is paying attention to you in a way that most just don't. Even her last boss fight, while a bit dodgy, is a pretty special experience when you consider how unique it was for the time. It is a bit full of unrealized potential, and it's one of the few parts of the game that doesn't ever quite make sense, and she's guarded by all these elite cyborgs that you think you'd be required to shoot through. But wrong again. You can just run past these goofballs and make a beeline for the Cyberspace terminal to initiate the final sequence. Somehow the game pauses the real world of the game so you can have a PvP match in Cyberspace. Go figure. Cyberspace itself is really confusing and it doesn't let you save, so this took me the better part of 45 minutes or so of repeated tries to stop getting lost and to make the long trek to the center of the maze to fight SHODAN successfully. And although the fight itself is really confusing to know when you're actually damaging her, is that sometimes it feels like you have to shoot her 30 times, and other times it feels like she dies in 3 shots, how she interacts with the player is a really special precedent for games to come. SHODAN's represented by this weird pinecone uterus looking thing, and she keeps pulling your view right and left as she attempts to take control of you because, we're on her turf now. To add even more urgency to this fight, the screen starts to slowly fade into the picture you see of her on your radio, as if her influence is slowly infecting your mind and taking over. If you don't kill her in time before her face takes up the whole screen, it's game over, man, game over.
What the fuck are we gonna do now? What are we gonna do?
It's not technically a great fight mechanically, but it is an awesome realization of SHODAN's character and how you are immersively affected both in terms of visibility and the actual control of your character as you fight her. SHODAN's not just a villain, she's a team player, if you will, and she makes the setting come alive in ways that few other contrivances could. SHODAN's direct responses to what you do make you feel like you're really part of the drama. They say every good hero needs a good villain to really feel like they're doing something important, and that saying could be truer here. There's even a false ending where you can shoot the laser at Earth without disabling the failsafe first, and there's a recorded line for her thanking you for saving her the trouble, a stark contrast to her infuriated response when you turn it off and ruin her plans.
Thank you. You have saved us all some effort by destroying the greater part of
Earth's civilization.
Yourself.
This pattern of reinforcement that something you did matters repeats over and over again, and the game subverts your expectations a lot by getting you used to her arrogant, condescending commentary as you break another one of her toys, but then giving you hope as you think you're just about to escape and she turns the tables on you and seizes back power in a scripted fashion. There's a great tug-of-war narratively between the player and the developer, as much as there is between Hacker and SHODAN, and while it's a subtle, seems to go without saying overlap, it's important to acknowledge why this design works so well for interactive media.
You have destroyed my beautiful station. You will not escape now. I am departing, but you shall remain to die. Kill my enemy, I create.
So, yeah, that's System Shock in a big theoretical nutshell. As for my personal experience of it, it often feels like a safe scumming guided tour more than a playthrough. It's so easy to die here even on the middle difficulty, and the signposting ranges from glaringly obvious to how in the world was I supposed to know what the function of this thing was, or that this switch flip would matter 3 levels away, that kind of thing. A big rule of the first Doom game, per John Romero, was that if you had a button or a switch, you needed to immediately show the player the result of them flipping that switch, and not make them backtrack across the whole level to see what effect their action just had. System Shock wants to be immersive and intuitive, but too often there's just not enough context as to what you just did or why that mattered. And as much as System Shock wants to be more than a shooter, it often feels very much like a sudden death corridor shooter. There's just a lot of inching down hallways and blasting away with the highest DPS weapon. And it has so much ammo by the game's end that you might as well just unload with your best stuff by the time the mid-game rolls around because you can't take it with you when you go. I'm usually very conservative with my resources, only bringing out my best stuff when I feel like I have to. But I think the game was actually allowing me to be way more free with how much I overkilled enemies instead of trying to attrition them out with mid-tier weaponry, trying to save my heavy-duty stuff for possible boss fights or crowds later on. But to its credit, while System Shock can feel just like a corridor shooter at times, it's never a power fantasy, it's never brainless. You're always breathing a sigh of relief that you got through the last encounter, so it has a much more survival horror bent than the satisfying strafing of Wolfenstein or Doom. I grew to enjoy the raw power of the Magnum pistol and the Scorpion machine gun when I wasn't just carving through enemies with the overpowered laser rapier like a mad Jedi, but I rarely ever felt like I wasn't having to take some damage or put myself under some risk in order to deal damage in the first place. But like most of these older games, System Shock is not so much fun as it is fascinating. System Shock was an attempt to create the ultimate immersive simulation. Looking Glass got rid of Underworld's RPG tropes and created the everybody's dead setting that was brought to life by audio logs. The world had to be treated and thought of as a real functioning set of interlocking pieces. The gameplay was oriented around hooks, not unlike how Jeremy Griesmer said that Halo benefited from 30 seconds of fun over and over again in order to make it a great game, or how Hugo Martin and id Software have wanted their recent Doom games to get people in the fun zone. System Shock's world featured far more dynamic feeling lighting and physics and height differentials, so that the world felt big, varied, and realistic. The controls are a pain to contend with and are admittedly overly complicated, but they're serviceable, and you have a lot of cool options to play with and an interesting subgame of how to balance the energy drain of your abilities with the patches that grant you similar but distinct abilities that also have side effects of their own. System Shock's also a triumph of scripted escalation that Half-Life probably took some big design cues from. You're always desperately searching for the cyborg shutoff so that you can respawn upon death instead of getting a game over, and that sense that your actions have stakes and that they matter in this world as you blow up cameras and nodes is motivating and creates a real sense of cause and effect. Everything in Citadel Station feels like it's immersively working together, but Looking Glass wasn't afraid to let SHODAN subvert these realistic expectations and let her push you around in scripted sequences where she locks something off or she ambushes you. There's a lot of first of its kind stuff going on here. Doug Church told Richard Rouse that
we've always believed that player choice was pretty central to what made it fun for people, and that player-centric stuff was what you remember. You remember the clever little thing you did more than you remember some cutscene. I think that was our philosophy of design. We were very state-based as opposed to event-based. Those cameras were a good example. It wasn't a matter of saying, if you've destroyed those 8 cameras in this order, then do this. It was much more of a case of, when we are in this state, the following thing happens. And that way you give the player the ability to get into that state however they want. Obviously back then, with our incredibly remedial physics and so on, there was a limited amount of that we could do. And obviously as we get where we can do more stuff and more interactions, that becomes more powerful. But even back then we were thinking about it that way, as much as we could at least.
System Shock programmer Mark LeBlanc echoes this sentiment.
The thing that's different about games is that it's this dynamic system. It's this thing that is happening to you right now. It's not something that an author wrote. It's not something that a bunch of actors did 6 months ago and was captured on film. It's something that is happening right now and could happen differently from the way it happens to anyone else.
And as noted immersive sim legend Harvey Smith put it,
I remember reading people at Valve saying player acknowledgement is a very powerful tool.
One of the characteristics that was prevalent inside Looking Glass that I think some companies, because of being beholden to contracts with their publishers or whatnot, was this underlying courage to do the right thing, even if it was dangerous and risky, like deleting the AI or redoing a system 3 weeks before shipping.
Harvey Smith continues that System Shock proved how far games had come and that there was a shift in the landscape.
But I remember playing System Shock one day, and I was near a very organic hallway that was faceted with bio-growth, and I had an EMP rifle that fired a big sphere of glowing energy that had physics that bounced. I know this doesn't sound like a big deal today, but I fired that gun down the hall, and the ball goes out, rotating and glowing, and all the facets lit up as it went down the hall. And it bounced and went around the corner, and I saw the light disappear around the corner. And it was like my life changed because I realized here's the application of lighting technology against polys and physics with bounce and path. I can make a bank shot with this weapon, and yet at the same time it is aesthetically beautiful. So the technology, every one of the games had some new technology in the service of player empowerment. An amazing component of the games, I thought.
That's where System Shock made its mark, and why we keep coming back to these games. Well, at least the cool people do. We keep playing the games that took off because of System Shock, like BioShock, or Prey 2017, or Doom 3, or Dead Space, and so many more games that use the audio log tropes and all of that. System Shock was a shock to the industry system in 1994, and it's shocking how fundamental its smartest ideas had become to game design. I hate to say it, but the best descriptor of this phenomenon comes from Kanye West, of all people.
What do you hope your legacy is?
To be forgotten. Who designed the water fountain? Who designed the stop sign? Who designed the stoplight? These things are so ubiquitous that the person that designed them is forgotten.
In many ways, Looking Glass's influence has been the ultimate test of immersion, kind of like Seamus Blackley's physics system, whose real test of quality is that you don't even notice they're there because it feels so real, so natural. And for a style of game that proudly calls itself an immersive simulation, I can't imagine a higher compliment.